when I was in The Hague for the NATO summit this past June, I could immediately tell that the mood was different. Compared to previous summits, there was a palpable fear that NATO could collapse after holding transatlantic security together for 76 years. The clincher in the end was a pledge by allies to boost their defense spending from 2% of GDP to 5%. The NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, also known as the Trump whisperer, used a healthy dose of praise and flattery to keep the mood light, and it worked. But while NATO is no longer on the edge of a precipice, the long-term survival of the alliance is by no means guaranteed. Trump is still resorting to his bullying behavior. In fact, it's grown worse and more coercive. If allies don't do enough on defense, Trump has indicated that he would not come to allies' defense, or he might outright kick them out of the alliance. This is very damaging for NATO's social fabric and for the credibility of Article 5, which commits allies to mutual defense. These fissures will be exploited by China and Russia. So Canada has been on the receiving end of Trump's bullying behavior. We've all heard the repeated references to Canada as the 51st state, and this has caused anger here at home. But if you look around, not a lot of allies are joining our pity party. Understandably, allies are being cautious and they want to pick their battles with the United States. And initially, while it may have felt good to boo at hockey games, this won't solve our geopolitical conundrum. Canada is strategically well positioned to play a greater role internationally. But we've not had that credibility because we've not kept pace with our allies in terms of defense spending. This is changing now. And Canadians are on board. When we look at Abacus data, Nanos Research, Angus Reid national surveys, we're seeing similar trends. Only 9% of Canadians were opposed to Carney's announcement of increased defense spending right after the federal election. When we look at the target specifically that NATO has set, 4 out of 5 Canadians support the 2% benchmark, and support for that 5% target is on the rise. Over the last year, support for increased defense spending has risen by 15 points, and there is broad agreement across party line. So why this sudden increase? Well, it's clear we don't trust the US anymore, but there's a willingness to do more on the global stage. This much was apparent right after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, but it's a relatively recent pivot for Canada. We have a lot to catch up on. A lot to catch up on in terms of increased defense spending, in terms of improving Canadians' understanding of defense policy, and of crafting a clear and coherent foreign policy vision based on our values and interests. Canada can be a leader at NATO and in other regional platforms. Canada has a promising Indo-Pacific strategy to further its relationships with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Canada has also been engaging in ASEAN to deepen its ties in Southeast Asia. This regional presence is essential to diversify our partnerships and our economy while countering Russia and meeting the systemic challenge that China represents. We are not at war, but Canada suffers daily attacks in what the military would call the cyber and information domains. China and Russia are deploying hybrid tactics against the West. They don't want to spark a military confrontation with NATO countries, at least not yet. They want to operate in the gray zone. And so this means they will use tactics like disinformation to erode societal cohesion and sow distrust in our institutions. Russia has been using these types of tactics for over 15 years, and they are growing increasingly effective, especially in sparking anti-gender backlash. Russia is spreading messages about its moral superiority and preserving traditional family values, and then mocking the West's supposed depravity. Instead of countering this Russian gender-based disinformation, we're hearing similar narratives emerging from the White House. Trump's culture wars were on full display when Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, summoned military leaders to Quantico on September 30th. This was right on the heels of senior military women being dismissed without cause after serving for decades in the US Armed Forces. Hegseth and Trump are promoting a one-size-fits-all, oddly specific, beardless male standard for the military. They are fetishizing lethality and putting it as a priority above all else, even threatening that this approach might be used on unruly American cities. This is very dangerous for the US, but it's also dangerous for Canada, given how deeply integrated our militaries are. So, we've been really eager to be in lockstep with our American allies in the past, but we cannot follow on this path. This path leads to corrosive civil-military relations and ignores vital and costly lessons that we have learned about how to achieve sustainable peace and security. For starters, we won't drop bombs on a whim, and we won't kick women out of combat roles. Canada made this clear when it appointed its first woman as Chief of the Defense Staff, Jenny Carignan. In a public rebuke of Pete Hegseth's comments on women in combat, she said that today, women in uniform should no longer have to justify their presence in the military. This was at the Halifax Security Forum 1 year ago, and she received a standing ovation. Women make an indispensable contribution to security and defense, and this is not up for debate in this country. Reversing decades of gender integration is not only unthinkable, it's counterproductive. It's contrary to who we are, and it would immediately make much worse our current military personnel shortfall. Once again, we can't afford to follow the US lead. Ironically, the previous Trump administration enacted the Women, Peace, and Security agenda into law. This makes the policy contradictions a little bit astounding. And this policy framework, this American statute, is based on sound research about the gendered impacts of war. When war breaks out, there are no strictly military solutions. Preventing conflict and responding to conflict requires entire societies. For example, research shows that when peace agreements involve women as mediators and negotiators, they tend to last longer. States that attack human rights and women's rights tend to fail. And countries that have low gender equality scores tend to be more violent and less prosperous. When we think about it, it's a fairly intuitive idea that works in a variety of contexts. When you fail to get broad buy-in, it's really tough to get a sustainable solution. Canada can work to get that buy-in through its diplomatic efforts. At the UN General Assembly, Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand, Queen's alumna, by the way, reaffirmed our values and talked about gender equality as a cornerstone of our foreign policy. We can't be shy to say it, and we're definitely not alone. NATO's own policy on women, peace, and security reaffirms that gender equality is both a strategic necessity and a core value. This is an official NATO document that achieved the consensus of all member states. But right now, the US is not interested in consensus. The United States has walked away from its global leadership role and is breathing down our neck. This has stiffened our spine. There's a window of opportunity here for Canada to play a bigger role. And yes, the gap to fill is enormous. A case in point is the reckless withdrawal of US foreign aid from the most vulnerable. NGOs and women's groups worldwide doing critical humanitarian work have been wiped out. This not only breaks a long-standing commitment to women and girls, but it also undermines regional security because remember, nations that fail women fail. Through evidence-based policymaking, Canada can do better. This is a crucial and pivotal moment for Canada.
I prefer this slide.
There are exciting opportunities ahead in charting this more independent course, including for universities like Queen's that happen to be at the forefront of policy-relevant research. Canada has established clear foundations for a renewed whole-of-society approach to security and defense. It requires all of you and building strong partnerships with Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and beyond. Partnerships that are based on our values and our interests because we are Canadian and we can do both. Thank you.